Hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about documenting functions in PHP. A lot of what I'm going to talk about could be applied to any language, but the language that you're talking about actually does matter. Some are strictly typed, some are loosely typed. PHP is a loosely typed language, so that makes this discussion a little more interesting because much of the discussion about documenting functions usually is focused on data types, and we're not as concerned about those in PHP, but we'll talk about it just the same. When documenting functions, block comments are a good choice. So depending on the language, you probably have block comments available to you. You got single line comments, you got block comments. Block comments are generally good and appropriate for functions because you're probably going to have multiple lines of comments. That said, there's no reason you couldn't do a bunch of single line comments. Why do you want to document your functions? Well, functions are all about reusability. So if you document your functions well, then they're going to be easier to reuse. And oftentimes, functions serve as small parts of a larger program. And so imagine a situation where you've got a bunch of different people writing functions, which are all going to be part of a big program. So clearly documenting your small contribution to the larger project is very important. I'm a teacher, so it's important for you to document your functions for me so I can have some idea of what in the heck you were intending to do. Otherwise, I'm just guessing. And the other thing it's one of those lessons that you really only learn from actually programming yourself, is they serve the purpose of reminding yourself what in the heck you were thinking. I mean, everyone who's written some code has been there. You're writing some code, you think you have some good ideas, you're going to see if it works, and sometimes it works. And that's good because you get through the short-term problem that you were trying to solve. But those functions allow you to maybe revisit your code a day later or a week later or a month later and figure out what it is that function that you wrote does. So functions are all about reusability, so your ability to understand them and explain them to others is important. And that's a lot of what documentation is about. So ways you can document functions. The best thing, the easiest thing, is just writing clear code. And on that note, a descriptive name for your function. So why not give your function a descriptive name? I mean, there's a lot of functions where you just look at the name of the function and you probably have a pretty good idea what it does. There's a whole bunch of functions where that certainly doesn't apply. So a descriptive name to your function is an excellent start. So ask yourself, what does it do? What's the best way I can kind of communicate that in the name of the function? Also, just writing clear code. That's a difficult one to explain. So clear code could be a descriptive function name. It could also be a descriptive names for your parameters. And just not, I guess in a function, understanding that you're going to be reusing this code and revisiting it and potentially sharing it with people. So in a function is probably not the best time to be a hack. I mean, so try and be clear about what you're writing and document it well. Type hinting, that is something that I will address very shortly. Type hinting is where you can actually enforce the types of parameters. I am just big on this thing right here, which is implying the types of the parameters by naming them accordingly. So if I have a parameter that I want to be a string, I'm probably going to name it str. So while I'm not forcing it to be a string, I am trying to communicate at a glance that it is a string. So those comments that you should do, just beyond writing clear, clean code. So functions should have the following documentation. And I also want to acknowledge right off the bat that there are some functions that don't really benefit from documentation. Some are so, like if it has no parameters, doesn't return anything, and it's got a descriptive name, right? Maybe it's a bit of a square peg in a round hole, but I'm just trying to teach you good habits just the same. So the critical things are, what does the function do? So first thing you write probably should be, what does this function do? The second thing is, tell me about the parameters. Are there any parameters? What types should they be? Do you need to explain what they represent? And explain the return value. If there is no return value, then you might want to say that there's no return value. If there's no return value, then it does something. And so say what it does. So maybe it prints something to a console, or it, I don't know, alters something. Sometimes a function is going to return something on an error. If a function returns something on an error, then you for sure would want to document that. A good example of that would be like a index of function where you're searching a string for a value. Generally speaking, if you search a string for a value and you don't find that value, they usually return -1. Like, that's a good example of what something does in an unexpected circumstance. So those are the guidelines, and I'm going to look at 3 functions today, and I'm going to show you my comments and tell you what I did for them. So I'm just going to talk about these things real quickly right now, and we'll look at the code in a minute. So my first function is going to be called countdown. It's going to accept a single parameter of type integer, and that void means it doesn't return anything. You don't need to write anything about that in PHP, but that's what you call a function that doesn't return anything. It just prints things out. The next one is going to be a function called proper. You pass it a string, and it returns a string. Proper noun is a word that's first letter is uppercase and all of the rest are lowercase. And the last one is exponent. Now, this is this is the weirdest one for sure, and this is the one we'll spend a little bit of time with. This is going to raise a base to an exponent. If you don't know exponents, I probably can't help you with that right now, but that's going to be the base, that's going to be the exponent, and this thing returns a float. The reason I went with a float is floats are bigger than exponents, and exponents can get big, so float. These could be floats. There's no reason they couldn't be. I just did ints because, I don't know, it didn't really matter. This is just an example. All right, so let's look at some examples. So here's my first one. Here's countdown. I told you what it does. So here's my comments. This is what I'm really talking about today. I'm not trying to look at what it actually does. I don't care what it does. That's kind of the beauty of functions. If they behave as they're supposed to behave and they meet their specifications, no one cares what's going on in here. All right, so this function displays a countdown from the parameter value down to 1 and then displays blast off. Right, so I'm saying what it does. I'm saying parameter 1, which is the only parameter here, is an integer, and it doesn't return anything. It uses echo to display the results. So those are those 3 things that I was saying you should do. Explain what the function does, explain the parameters, if there are any, and explain the return value. And if there's not a return value, you could explain what it does. This is weird. Like, I feel like this third part is, sometimes I force it, but I'm trying to teach you folks how to write well-documented code, so I don't mind forcing it, but sometimes I do sit here thinking about what am I supposed to write there? Didn't I kind of explain that right there? Well, I don't know. I guess I did. All right. The next one is that proper function. So formats a string as a proper noun. Param1 is a string, returns a string. A proper noun starts with an uppercase letter and the rest is lowercase. So this is kind of an optional thing, but I know perfectly well that people don't know what proper nouns are. Well, some don't, So I thought it was worth explaining what that is. Again, right? We're not trying to get into the guts of the function. Part of function design is testing your functions. Trust me, I think these work. But I'm talking about how to document them right now. And the last one's the most interesting one. This one is exponent. So computes the value of a base raised to an exponent. Param1 is a number, and that's the base. Param2 is a positive number, and that's the exponent. It returns a float, which is the result of the exponentation. Note, I put a note in here. This function should work just fine with floats as opposed to ints. Returns a float to accommodate larger numbers. So those design decisions that I made and why I did what I did. And also this is important, right? You see how in the documentation I said it's a number? In a strictly typed language, I would have to be clear about whether those were floats or integers, but in loosely typed language like PHP, it really doesn't matter. All right, so this works. Let me show you. I'm just going to test this last one just because I want to get into a few weird things here because I can. So let's pass it like 3. That should be 27. And there's my 27. It works. I'm not trying to prove that it works. What I am trying to do is some weird stuff here. So let's say that my base was 3.5, right? And so at this point, it's not an integer, but I'm telling you it's going to work just fine. There's no reason you can't have a base that's a fractional value. Same with the exponent. But I want to show you about that type hinting thing. So if I do that, that's what you call type hinting. Now I'm enforcing that that thing is an integer. Now if I save that and I reload this page, it now blows up on me because the argument didn't match the parameter type. There are some that argue that PHP is a loosely typed language. This is not in the spirit of the language. So, this is a weird situation because I probably should have just set it up to accept floats and, everything's all, fine, right? If I do that, then no big deal. What that would do is kind of protect us from the situation where someone passed a string. Or, I could do something like, if I want to imply that these things should be ints, I could do that. Of course, right, and then you get into a weird situation like that. So you see on this one where there was more to it than the type, whereas they actually represented something. I think it was smart to name them things like base and expo, so someone could make some sense out of what goes what, because the order of parameters does matter, and that's why you call them param1 and param2. So I just kind of showed you type hinting as well. Now the other interesting case here, the last one I want to show you, because I don't know, I guess we've gone 10 minutes, so might as well go a little longer. We are going to get into trouble here if you pass a negative exponent. If you look at the way this loop is structured, it's going, it's just not going to do what it's supposed to do. So negative exponents, if you don't know much about exponents, these are decimals, I guess is the best way to explain that quickly. This isn't going to work right. So the way this function's written, it needs to be able to pick up on negative exponents because it's just not going to work the way that you want it to work. So I guess what I would want to do in that situation is I would just want to say something like if expo is less than 0, then return -1, I guess. So that would be one of those examples of if there's a situation that you need to check, then that would be something I would need to document. So I'd say return -1 on negative exponent. This does not accommodate those. It does not work for those. Something like that. So at this point, I have kind of talked about everything here. So if the function does something weird on an error, you need to explain that. But in the general sense, you want to explain what the function does, what do the parameters look like, what do the return values look like, and also there are some functions that don't benefit a lot from it. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of guidance on how to better document your functions. If you're new to programming, right, kind of stick with this format and you'd be in good shape. So what does it do? Tell me about the parameters. Tell me about the return value. If there's anything you think might be beneficial to explain, do that. If there's any weird cases, then explain that. And that's a good start to documenting your functions. Thanks for watching.